Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at different voting behaviour questions, and I've chosen this topic because um, there can sometimes be kind of slight variations in the questions that are asked, and depending on how the question is worded will depend on what you need to write about. Okay, so here we have three different types of questions. Um, and we're going to distinguish between the different types of questions to work out how we should approach each one. So I always recommend that you write three middle paragraphs, three or four. So that means an introduction followed by three or four middle paragraphs and then a conclusion. So each of those three or four middle paragraphs should be about a different thing. So today we're going to look at on the assumption that you do three middle paragraphs, and there's three questions on the screen at the moment. Evaluate the view that class remains the most significant factor in determining voting behaviour. That's question one. Question two, evaluate the view that the influence of the media in determining election outcomes is exaggerated. And number three, evaluate the view that the media exerts more influence in UK politics than pressure groups. So, what I'd like you to do in a moment is pause the video and think about how you would write paragraphs for each of those three questions. So plan an answer for each of the three questions above. What this might mean is just bullet pointing three things that you'd write about. So for question one, three bullet points, they would be the three middle paragraphs. So if you can do that for each of the three questions on the screen, pause the video now, and then once you unpause, we will look at each question in turn. Okay, so the first question, evaluate the view that class remains the most significant factor in determining voting behaviour. There's a few things about this question. First of all, it says evaluate the view that class remains the most significant factor. So there is an assumption here that historically class has been the most significant factor. Sometimes in Edexcel, the question will have an assumption in there and we just have to go with it. So we're going to assume that class has historically been the most significant factor and we have to evaluate whether it still is. This is a question that invites you to compare. It's saying, is class still the most significant factor? Is it the most significant? And so if it is the most significant thing, then it's more significant than the other factors. If it is no longer the most significant factor, then that means that there are other factors, or at least one other factor, that is more influential or more significant. So the first paragraph should definitely be about class. It is the thing in the question. So if there's a question like this, where it asks you, is this the most significant factor? Then that should be the first paragraph. The second paragraph would be probably the factor that you think is the most significant. Now, if the most significant factor is the thing in the question, then I'll get to that in a moment. But let's assume that we think that class is no longer the most significant factor. Maybe we think it's something like age. Well, then that would be the second paragraph. And the third paragraph will be another important factor. I recommend that you pick factors that you think are important. Whether they're more important than the thing in the question or not is another matter. But pick three significant factors. Don't pick a factor you don't think is significant at all, because it will kind of weaken your analysis. So let's go with class. Maybe we could say age, and maybe we could say region, or maybe not region, but something else, maybe party unity, salient issues, or valence, or something like that. But either way, we've got three paragraphs. And the way I would do this is to talking about class, first paragraph. Class, first half of the paragraph, talk about the ways in which class is significant still. And then in the second half of that paragraph, then talk about perhaps the limitations of this, ways in which perhaps the influence of class has declined, with an evaluative section at the end of that, which weighs up whether class is the most significant factor today. Let's imagine we then go with age as the second paragraph. For the first half of that paragraph, we can talk about the ways in which age is a significant factor. It was certainly significant in 2017 and 2019. However, we should then think about ways in which maybe age is not such a significant factor. And we can talk about maybe that this is a short-term thing, and maybe it's not possible yet to draw kind of long-term conclusions or a trend over time. You could talk about how maybe the 2017 and 2019 elections were due to other circumstances. Young people favoured Corbyn. You know that might be an argument you can make, and whether or not young people will continue to vote Labour remains to be seen, because it certainly wasn't such a factor before 2017. And then we can talk about a third factor. So we can talk about salient issues, and we can say that actually in modern elections, perhaps it's not social factors, but you know, voters take a more sort of consumerist approach to voting, and they think about which issues are important in any given election. In 2010, the salient issue was, which party do we think are best going to, you know, recover from the global financial crisis? In 2019, the salient issue was, which party do we think will best deal with Brexit? And maybe that's the factor that determines how people vote. Whichever factors you choose, I think the evaluation within each paragraph should then evaluate it to class. So you're talking about age in paragraph 2. You need to conclude whether or not that makes age more significant than class or not, and why. If for the third paragraph we're writing about salient issues, your evaluation, after you've written about how salient issues are significant, followed by maybe how they are limited in their significance, the evaluation should then weigh up whether or not salient issues are more significant than class, because class is what the question is asking. That's how I would do question 1. Question 2, evaluate the view that the influence of the media in determining election outcomes is exaggerated. There is no invitation to compare here. Sometimes students make a mistake of then writing a paragraph about the media followed by a paragraph about other factors, similar to question 1. But there is no invitation to compare. This question isn't saying, is media the most significant factor? It's essentially saying, how significant is the media? Is it exaggerated? And so 3 paragraphs about 3 different types of media is a logical way to go. So we can talk about the print media or newspapers, we can talk about broadcast media or television, and we can talk about social media. Now, print media is things other than newspapers, but newspapers is logically probably the thing that you'd go for. Likewise, broadcast media. Radio is also broadcast media, but there aren't too many things we can say about that, really. The thing I always think of is, I think it was in 2017, Corbyn had a tough time on Women's Hour, which is a BBC radio programme. He was not able to recall figures for how he was going to fund the policies in his manifesto, which was quite embarrassing for him. But generally speaking, we'll probably be talking about television now. And so, you know, we can talk about newspapers, and we can talk about how newspapers have historically been a significant factor and are perhaps not so much a significant factor anymore. You know, newspaper circulation is in decline and so on. With television, we can talk about how television helps frame political issues. One of the things students do a lot of the time with television is focus quite narrowly on those leadership elections, or those leadership debates. But there is more to say about television than just that. You know, television is not just influential on those kind of 3 hours every 5 years. There is a kind of constant influence with television, and television also kind of emphasizes specific characteristics of leadership. You know, those who can present themselves best on television are generally perceived and received much better by the public. Maybe that's a reason why, you know, prime ministers like Tony Blair or maybe David Cameron, the more kind of shiny, telegraphic, telegenic. You know, that might be a reason why the likes of maybe Tony Blair and David Cameron, the more sort of flashy, shiny, telegenic prime ministers, are perceived as more competent in some ways than the likes of maybe Theresa May or Gordon Brown, who are less charismatic and maybe less comfortable in front of a camera. There are, of course, many reasons why some prime ministers are considered more powerful than others, but I think presentation certainly plays a part there. And we can talk about social media. Social media is obviously growing in influence, and you can talk about the deregulated nature of social media and the influence that that has. With this question, you can bring in other factors, but only in relation to what the for this question, you can introduce other factors, but it has to be in relation to the different types of media. So you can talk about newspapers and talk about how younger people generally don't read newspapers. You can talk about social media and talk about how social media is preferred by young people, although older people are using social media more. So you can bring in other factors. You can talk about television and its ability to frame and shape public opinion, and how it can prioritize some salient issues over others. But primarily, you are just talking about. So the important thing to remember with this type of question is that you are primarily focusing on the different types of media. You can bring in other factors. So you can talk about, for example, how younger people generally don't read newspapers, or how younger people tend to prefer social media. You can make links between how newspapers and television and social media can help kind of frame and determine what the salient issues might be at any given time. But primarily, you are focusing on the media types rather than comparing the media to other factors. So it would be a mistake to answer this question by saying age is the most significant factor, not the media, because that's not what the question is asking. And that is something that occasionally students will do. So your evaluations, as it says here, your evaluations can consider. So your evaluations can consider the influence of each type of media. Do not assume that the influence of one form of media is the same as the influence of another. So that means, it's absolutely fine to say that the influence of newspapers is in decline, that the influence of social media is increasing, and you can determine whatever you like with television. It has been quite a consistent influence for several decades now. That would be the thing I would say. And here's the third question then. The third question is evaluate the view that the media exerts more influence in UK politics than pressure groups. This is a different type of question. It's not strictly a voting behaviour question, this one, although there are elements of voting behaviour that you will consider. So for me, what I would be looking at is different types of influence. This is a thematic approach here, where you ask yourself, well, okay, how can the media and pressure groups influence UK politics? And you can see there's one on the screen here already. The media and pressure groups can influence over policy. They can have influence over parties. They can have influence over the government. The media and pressure groups can influence public opinion, and the media and pressure groups can influence how agenda setting, and the media and pressure groups can influence the agenda. So agenda setting, prioritizing what's important at any given time. The media and pressure groups can educate the public and can frame political issues. What I mean by framing political issues is that the media and pressure groups can kind of help put political issues into context. It can help us kind of prioritize the political issues that we think are important at any given time. And so that would be one way to address this question. But the key here is that this is a question where we're being asked to compare two things, the media and pressure groups. So each of those middle paragraphs must consider both. So the first paragraph might say, is it the media or pressure groups that exerts more influence over policy? And then you weigh up the arguments for and against, and you make a judgment. And then the second paragraph will be, is it the media or pressure groups that exert influence over shaping public opinion? And you consider both the media and pressure groups, and you reach a judgment. And then you move on to the third paragraph. Is it the media or pressure groups that are better at setting the agenda? You can consider both and then make a judgment. But the key here is that each of those middle paragraphs will consider both. That's really important. What we cannot have is half of an essay that looks at the media, followed by half of an essay that follows pressure groups. That is not an effective way to do it. It won't be very analytical. There'll be no precise comparisons in there, and the judgments will be much weaker. So as you can see, it says there in blue, the key here is to take a thematic approach. What ways can the media and pressure groups influence UK politics, and compare this type of influence for both things being the media and pressure groups. Finally, this is something that I recommend with my students in class. There is a grid here. You can see the grid. So if you don't have a copy of this grid, you can make your own. There are loads of factors on the left-hand column, and I think it's a really good way to prepare for this type of question, where you can consider the influence of various factors before 97, the influence of those factors in 1997, and the influence of those factors in elections after 97. The exam board do seem quite interested in 1997 as a case study, and they sometimes specify that you have to consider a trend over time from before 97 and after. So it's worth doing. You can use Ipsis Mori as a research tool. Their website is really good for this. And also, there's a spiel here about how we can make links between factors. So again, if you want to pause this video and just read through that, it's just something I've written just to make the point that really what we need to do is not just consider factors in isolation, but understand that some factors relate to others and influence them. So that is it. Good luck in your exams, and hopefully you'll be able to work out what each type of question is asking you to do. And the key is to focus on answering the question that's in front of you, not answering a question similar to the one that's in front of you. Good luck.